Quilter Lezley Zwaal. Today I will be sharing how you can make a binding for your quilt that you can just add a touch of zing without trying to sneak a very small strip of fabric between the binding and the quilt. It also comes in handy if you haven't had quite enough fabric left to make that binding. First, you will need two contrasting colors for your binding. One that will be a larger visible part that matches the quilt, and the faux piping part will basically stand out against the quilt. So in the end, you're going to have a piece that looks like this that's going to be your binding. And that will add a little extra zing to your quilt. The piping piece itself is much wider than what you see. It's going to be the wider of the two strips, and it will basically appear to be between the binding and the quilt top. Measure the length of binding that you will need for the quilt just as you would any quilt. That being the added length of all the raw edges of the outside quilt. I say all because not all quilts are square or rectangular. Experience has taught me to measure the total length and divide by 42, which is the standard width of fabric. Round up to give yourself wiggle room. Extra fabric is used in the corners and the joints and things like that. And I also recommend the bias joining of a strip because you get a much nicer, flatter end result. You need to cut 7 widths of fabric of the piping or the zinger fabric. It will be the wider strip at 1.5 inches wide. Cut 7 widths of fabric of the quilt fabric. It will be the narrower strip at 1.25 inches wide. Join the lengths of each binding fabric separately, the wider strips together end to end and the narrower strips end to end. Join them using the bias joint for a flatter finish. There are several videos available for that. Jenny Doan has a great video that I promote. Now you need to join the two strips together along the long edge. Be sure to avoid matching up any of the seams where the strips were joined together. So you'll end up with a long piece that is basically the two pieces together. The zinger is the wider, and the binding that you normally would see is the narrower. Press the seam towards the narrower strip and match the quilt fabric. Do not press that long seam open. Don't press it open, press it to the narrower strip. Then you want to take your piece of binding here and fold it in half. When you fold it in half, you end up with a piece of little piping and then the big piping color on the back side. Normally, you attach your binding to the front of your quilt and turn it over to the back. In this particular case, for the faux piping, you have to attach the folded binding to the back. And you also have to make sure that the two colors are against the back of the quilt. So when you're putting it on to the back of the quilt, the back side of the fabric, you want to make sure that the piping, two pieces colors are there, and then when you go to actually wrap the binding around, you're going to bring it over and you're going to have your binding and your piping showing through. Once the binding is attached, of course, turn it to the front, stitch in the ditch along the little piping line right in the ditch, and use the brighter color if you want in the ditch part, because that's the fabric you're going to be catching. And basically put the binding on the way you normally put binding on a quilt. The same corners that you do, the same ending that you do to put the two pieces together. If you want to use a wider piping, like more of a flange, this is a wider version. You have a little slightly different measurements. The wider fabric is 1 3/4 inches wide, and the narrow fabric, matching the quilt fabric, is only 1 inch wide. This is an example of using the piping. At the back, it kind of disappears. It's the regular binding at the back. When you turn it over to the front and stitch it down, that's the kind effect you get. You're able to do the corner pieces just like you normally do, and the joins like you normally do. Thank you for joining us on this first virtual sew day for Quilts of Valor Canada. I hope you enjoyed learning about how to make a faux binding or a faux piping or faux flange. This video will be uploaded to the website for you to rewatch at any time and share it with your friends.